Welcome to another episode of What If California Becomes an Independent Country of Its Own? On Life Fact Daily, we will have an insight on California's rising independence dream. And what if it becomes a reality? California has always been more than just a state. It's a global icon, home to Hollywood, Silicon Valley, the Golden Gate Bridge, and endless farmland that feeds much of the world. With over 40 million residents, its population rivals entire countries. Its economy alone produces trillions of dollars each year, ranking among the largest on the planet. In fact, if California stood alone, it would surpass Japan to become the fourth largest economy in the world. That's why whispers of secession, the idea that California could break away and become its own country, are no longer treated as jokes. There's serious discussions happening in living rooms, universities, political offices, and activist groups. Many Californians feel that their state's values are pulling further away from the rest of America. While Washington wrestles with political gridlock and national divides, California imagines a future where it shapes its own destiny. Polls taken in 2025 reveal something historic. Nearly half of California citizens would vote for independence if given the chance, and more than half agree that California could be better off as a separate nation within the next decade. That level of support is unprecedented. The movement has even been given a name, Calexit, a bold echo of Brexit, the United Kingdom's departure from the European Union. But what would secession really mean? Could it happen peacefully? Or would it spark a political, economic, and even military crisis? To understand California's independence dream, we have to break it down step by step, from its economy and culture to its relationship with Washington and the world. If California were to declare independence tomorrow, the very first question the world would ask is, can it survive on its own economically? The answer, surprisingly, is yes, at least on paper. California isn't just big, it's massive. The state's economy is valued at over $4 trillion, making it larger than most entire countries. If independent, it would sit proudly in the global top 5 economies, ahead of powerhouses like Japan, Germany, and the United Kingdom. This isn't just a matter of scale. It's a reflection of California's unique diversity in industries. Tech drives much of the boom. Silicon Valley is home to Apple, Google, Meta, Tesla, and dozens of other companies that shape the modern world. Billions of people rely on products, apps, and services that originate in Northern California. If independence ever came, these companies would instantly become symbols of a new California republic, fueling global recognition. But California isn't just tech. Hollywood and the entertainment industry dominate global culture. Movies, music, and streaming content from Los Angeles reach every corner of the planet, making California a soft power giant. In agriculture, the state produces nearly 2/3 of America's fruits and nuts, along with massive exports of wine, dairy, and vegetables. Without California, American grocery stores would be emptier and food prices across the nation would skyrocket. Then there are the ports. Los Angeles and Long Beach together make up the busiest port complex in the Western Hemisphere. Nearly half of all U.S. imports and 1/3 of exports flow through California's docks. If the state left the Union, it would control some of the most vital gateways to Asia, reshaping America's trade and supply chains overnight. The numbers show California is more than capable of standing on its own. Over the past 25 years, its economy has grown faster than the U.S. as a whole, and its per capita income has outpaced nearly every other large state. The workforce continues to expand, drawing immigrants and workers from across the globe. Yet, with all that strength, independence wouldn't be smooth sailing. For one, California sends far more tax money to Washington than it gets back in federal aid. That's good news if it became independent. It could redirect those billions into building a new government. But those funds currently support essential programs like Medicare, Social Security, and federal pensions. California would need to either recreate them or risk leaving millions of residents in limbo. And then there's the matter of debt. California runs a significant budget deficit, even while thriving economically. Without Washington's safety net, it would need to carefully balance spending on healthcare, defense, infrastructure, and welfare. Otherwise, the Golden State's dream of independence could quickly tarnish. Still, the foundation is solid. California has the economy, the innovation, and the cultural influence to survive, perhaps even thrive, as its own nation. But independence isn't just about money. It's also about legality, loyalty, and military power. And that's where things get complicated. Economic strength alone isn't enough to break free. The real question is, can California actually secede? Legally speaking, the answer is no. Both the U.S. Constitution and California's own state constitution declare the Union indivisible. There is no legal pathway for a state to simply walk away. This was tested before, most famously during the Civil War, and the result was devastating bloodshed. The Supreme Court later reaffirmed in the 1869 case Texas versus White that states cannot unilaterally secede. The only two paths are through revolution or with the consent of all the other states. Think about that for a moment. For California to leave peacefully, the legislatures of the remaining 49 states would have to agree to let it go. Given how deeply intertwined California's economy, culture, and political influence are with the rest of the nation, that seems nearly impossible. The alternative, then, is confrontation. If California declared independence, Washington would likely refuse to recognize it. Federal agencies would continue to operate, and U.S. courts would declare the secession illegal. To assert its independence, California's leaders might shut down federal offices, take control of borders, and even declare martial law. That act alone would bring them into direct conflict with the federal government. And here lies the most explosive issue: the military. California is home to more than 30 major military bases, including some of America's most critical defense hubs. Naval Base San Diego houses the Pacific Fleet, the U.S. Navy's main strike force in the Pacific Ocean. Camp Pendleton trains tens of thousands of Marines for deployment overseas. Edwards Air Force Base, Fort Irwin, and Marine Corps Air Station Miramar are all essential for national security. Would the United States simply abandon these assets? Highly unlikely. These bases are too strategically valuable, not just for America, but for global stability. Losing San Diego, for example, would cripple the U.S. Navy's ability to project power in the Pacific, especially against rivals like China. So what happens to the soldiers stationed there? Many are not from California. They're from Texas, New York, Ohio, and across the country. Would they follow orders from a newly declared California Republic or remain loyal to the U.S. flag? History suggests most would stay loyal to Washington, but divided loyalties could create chaos. Imagine a standoff between American soldiers on U.S. orders and Californian authorities demanding control of the same base. The risk of open conflict would be frighteningly real. Even if war didn't break out immediately, California would face a serious problem: defense. The U.S. military is the most powerful force on the planet, armed with nuclear weapons, advanced air power, and global alliances. California, starting from scratch, would need to build its own military while fending off political and economic retaliation. That means drafting soldiers, buying equipment, and establishing defense treaties, all while under intense pressure. Some advocates of independence argue that California wouldn't need a massive military right away. They believe the state's economic importance would make it too valuable to fight, forcing the U.S. into negotiation. Others argue California could seek rapid alliances with Canada, Mexico, or even NATO to secure protection. But all of this remains speculative and risky. The military dilemma shows the harsh reality. While California might have the wealth to stand alone, Washington has the firepower to make leaving extremely difficult. Independence wouldn't just be a political statement. It could turn into a standoff with tanks, ships, and fighter jets at the heart of America's most prosperous state. Even if California somehow navigated the legal minefield and survived a tense standoff with Washington, the question remains, what happens to the people who live there? Citizenship would become one of the thorniest issues of independence. Would Californians automatically lose their U.S. citizenship and become citizens of a new California republic? Would they hold dual citizenship? What about Americans living in California temporarily? Students, military families, or workers? And what about Californians living in other states? Millions of lives would suddenly hang in the balance. Consider federal benefits. Programs like Social Security, Medicare, and veterans' pensions are all run by Washington. If California left, would retirees in Los Angeles suddenly stop receiving checks? Would veterans lose health care at VA hospitals? Unless California immediately created its own replacement programs, millions of people would face uncertainty overnight. Healthcare would also be a huge challenge. Many hospitals in California rely on federal funds for Medicare and Medicaid reimbursements. Independence could disrupt that flow instantly, forcing the new government to either raise taxes, cut costs, or plunge into debt to keep the system afloat. Then there's governance itself. California already runs a massive state government, but running a country is a completely different scale. It would need new ministries for defense, foreign affairs, trade, and immigration. It would need an independent central bank, its own currency or digital payment system, and a fully functioning diplomatic corps. Overnight, California would go from running schools and highways to running an entire nation. But there's one advantage: money. California consistently sends billions more in taxes to Washington than it receives back. That gap could be redirected to fund new national programs. Supporters of independence often argue this financial imbalance proves California could afford to stand alone. But skeptics warn those redirected funds would vanish quickly when faced with the cost of building a military, replacing federal benefits, and handling international diplomacy. Global recognition is another vital step. California would need to join the United Nations, sign treaties, and negotiate trade agreements with countries around the world. Some nations, particularly U.S. allies, might hesitate to recognize California for fear of angering Washington. Others, like China or Russia, might welcome the chance to weaken U.S. unity and rush to embrace the new republic. California could also rejoin organizations that the U.S. has stepped away from, such as the Paris Climate Accord, UNESCO, and the World Health Organization. With its reputation for environmental leadership and technological innovation, California might quickly position itself as a progressive global leader on climate change, renewable energy, and digital rights. But recognition doesn't solve every problem. If the U.S. refused to accept California's independence, trade could be blocked, federal assets could be frozen, and California residents traveling abroad could find their passports invalid. The transition would be messy, complex, and full of uncertainty. Daily life for ordinary Californians would change dramatically. Taxes might rise as the new government scrambles to fund its institutions. Healthcare and social benefits might be delayed or disrupted. Businesses that rely on U.S. trade networks could face sudden tariffs. Even crossing state borders, something Americans take for granted, could involve passports, customs checks, and new travel restrictions. Yet at the same time, Californians could feel a surge of national pride. Their culture, their economy, and their values would no longer be diluted by federal politics. Instead of being just a state, California could stand tall as a nation, shaping its own future on the world stage. But independence wouldn't only reshape life inside California. It would also transform if California ever became independent. The shockwaves wouldn't stop at its borders. The United States itself would be forever changed, politically, economically, and even culturally. Politically, Washington would lose its most populous and liberal-leaning state overnight. That would completely reshape the balance of power. Without California's millions of Democratic voters, Republicans would likely dominate Congress and the Electoral College for years, maybe decades. Every presidential election would tilt sharply to the right, changing the course of U.S. policy on issues from healthcare and education to foreign affairs and climate change. This new political reality might deepen America's divisions. Other progressive states like Oregon, Washington, or even New York might wonder if they too would be better off on their own. At the very least, the loss of California could fuel calls for greater autonomy in states that feel alienated for federal power. the United States might become more fractured than ever before. Economically, the damage would be immediate. Losing California would strip away 14% of U.S. GDP and nearly 12% of its population. California's ports handle nearly half of America's imports and a third of exports. Overnight, those routes would belong to a foreign country, forcing Washington to renegotiate trade and shipping agreements. Supply chains would falter, prices would rise, and everyday goods could become more expensive across the nation. Agriculture would hit especially hard. California produces a massive share of America's food supply: almonds, grapes, lettuce, strawberries, and more. Without California, those products would suddenly become foreign imports, subject to tariffs and trade negotiations. Grocery bills across the U.S. could skyrocket. Culturally, the United States would lose some of its greatest engines of influence. Hollywood is a global symbol of American identity, producing movies and shows that reach billions worldwide. Silicon Valley creates the technologies that define modern life. If California left, those industries would no longer be American. They would belong to a new California republic, stripping the U.S. of much of its soft power. On the world stage, America's position as a superpower would weaken. Rivals like China and Russia would see opportunity in America's fractured unity. Allies in Europe and Asia might lose confidence in Washington's ability to lead. The loss of California, with its economy, population, and cultural weight, would mark the biggest shift in U.S. power since its founding. Meanwhile, California would face challenges of its own. Its independence could spark capital flight, with businesses relocating to avoid uncertainty. Tech giants like Tesla have already shown willingness to leave for states with lower taxes. Water rights, already a contentious issue in the West, could turn into international disputes if neighboring states restrict access. And while California has ambitious green energy goals, it still relies heavily on energy imports that could be disrupted by political tension. Immigration policy could shape California's future, too. As one of the most diverse regions in the world, with millions of foreign-born residents, California might welcome even more international talent. But a booming population would strain housing, infrastructure, and affordability, challenges that already dominate California's politics today. For everyday Californians, the dream of independence could feel like both liberation and chaos. Some would celebrate a new identity, waving the bear flag as a proud national symbol. Others would worry about their savings, health care, or the future of their jobs. Across the U.S., millions of Americans would feel the absence of California in their politics, their economy, and their culture. In the end, California's independence would be more than a local event. It would be a global earthquake, shaking the foundations of the United States and rewriting the balance of power in the 21st century. Whether such a break ever happens remains uncertain. But one thing is undeniable. If the Golden State ever stood alone, the world would never be the same. The United States itself, politically, culturally, and economically. For more chilly videos, subscribe, share, and like our channel. Life Facts Daily.